In this episode of My Words, My Book, we have Dan Freedman and Geey. Dan is a Sunday Times best-selling author whose global book sales have reached 1 million copies sold. He's best known for his hugely popular series of Jamie Johnson football novels. The series has helped a generation of readers into books and has been adapted for TV by the BBC. Daniel, as well as his role as a lawyer, he has written and co-authored several best-selling books, speaks at global conferences, posts regular blogs and co-hosts the Dan and Omar Show, a podcast where he mainly talks about football with Omar Chaudhuri, and also hosts his own podcast, Build the Invisible. So, Dan, first question to you. Why did you become an author? What's your story?
I guess a combination of a few things. Ultimately, I wanted to write the kind of books that I needed when I was younger. And also there was a sort of timing-wise, a bit of a gap in the market, I thought, in terms of proper novels that parents and teachers would think looked like proper books, but that had loads of football in them, that kids like me would want to read. And it was just at the time that Harry Potter was coming out. And in my simple brain, I was like, well, books about a kid trying to be a wizard, that's gone well. I'll do a series of books about a kid trying to be a footballer. Created this character called Jamie Johnson, and then got rejected by every single publisher in the country for 3 years. So that made me want it even more, I would say.
Well, I've never actually known the answer where sort of Jamie Johnson, the actual name, came from in the first place.
Alliteration's good. So J and J. Jamie Johnson, I feel like it's got a sort of rhythm to it and it's easy to say and remember. Jamie Johnson doesn't sound too like, I wanted kids to think as though they could be Jamie Johnson. So if you went Peregrine Absquark was the name, it's a bit, puts a bit of distance there. It also sounds quite like a fast winger in football, Jamie Johnson. And then somewhere in the back of my mind, the greatest ever player that played for Celtic was a winger who bamboozled opposing defences with this skill and who had bright red hair, which is a bit like my character, and that guy was called Jimmy Johnston. So, and I read while I was already writing the book, I read an obituary of Jimmy Johnston who died. And he was a bit like Dennis Law, actually, in terms of people looked up to him and the skill, but he would sometimes get in trouble off the pitch, and that was the combination I was looking for with Jamie, the ups and downs of life and football. So I think those are the combination of thoughts.
And that's how I got to know you, was from the Jamie Johnson books, because of my two sons, who are now 31 and 27.
Wow.
And the youngest, I think at the time, was age 8, when the first, which was 17 years ago, which is just, it seems like yesterday. And then what's even more remarkable about the Jamie Johnson books is that they're now on television. And I think that's, do you want to just share how that got into CBBC and the story behind that?
5 years of conversations with the BBC. Initially the thought was, well, would kids who love football, wouldn't they be out just playing football rather than watching it on TV like a drama or even reading the books? But then we got a 3-part mini-series, and suddenly we had to find a kid to play Jamie Johnson who could act and play football, somewhere to film. And we actually did open casting in Manchester. And I was a bit disappointed because I thought we'd have thousands of kids coming to play this amazing prodigy on TV, but it was a summer's day, there weren't that many people. And then I heard this one boy speak, and I said, can you just keep on talking? And it was a really unusual experience because he sounded like Jamie Johnson, even though I'd never heard Jamie Johnson speak before because he had just been a fictional character in the books. And it turned out this boy, Lewis, his whole life was very, very similar to Jamie. And when you put the camera on him and asked him to do football skills, he could nail every skill, which I've worked with footballers. Sometimes they're amazing, but you put the camera on them and it's not quite so easy. And then, yeah, there were 7 series, been all around the world, I think at least 73 different countries, 3 series of a spin-off. And it's great because it's all about story, isn't it? And I think obviously we're here to talk about books, which are very, very special. But broadcasting, it's called that for a reason, isn't it? And to get the to transfer it to screen and to broadcast it around the world, it is amazing to think of the amplification of that story.
And the impact that's having on so many children on a global level. But it's important to share that how the Jamie Johnson books went on to TV, similarly with my books, Jojo and Gran Gran, how that became a TV series as well.
And have you found with Jamie Johnson, it was like, so some real players, for example, like Steven Gerrard and Wayne Rooney, they inspired Jamie Johnson, the fictional character. And then the fictional character has now inspired, like Jude Bellingham used to watch the TV show when he was growing up, and that inspired him. So then the fictional character inspired a real player. Have you found that as well, that like the interaction between fictional characters and real people watching it, and the way that fiction and life?
On my travels, children say to me they want to become an author. And then I hear stories from grandparents as well. This is like myself with my grandchildren. So I think that is a positive. You're inspiring children. That's what we want, to be readers and to be writers. So that is a positive, you know. And I think, Daniel, over to yourself, because you work within the footballing industry. Do you want to share your role, how you connect with professional footballers?
Well, I mean, it started out to a degree, my short story, because just like Dan, we're a little bit mad and obsessive about football, aren't we? So I grew up in Liverpool, just devouring any and all information I could possibly find about the beloved Liverpool Football Club back in the day. Hasn't changed to a degree, but what that evolved to is I had a lot of lawyers in the family. I guess I sort of did a law degree just because why not? I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a football agent for quite a while, as we talked about, and that didn't quite happen. And so I sort of went into this default position of being a lawyer, but always wanting to have this side hustle or full-time hustle, I guess, of being a football lawyer. But it didn't come easy and was probably about 10, 12 years in the making of gradually building connections, building knowledge. And one of the ways that I effectively tried to build knowledge was to blog about the football industry. And that's where my love of writing, if not reading, which came before. And that's what sort of sparked the idea for the first book that I'd written called Done Deal, where I tried to lift a lid on what happens actually in the football industry if it's a transfer or a contract renegotiation or a boot deal, or when things go wrong. And from there, at different times, and I've worked with a lot of different male and female players, managers, coaches, directors of football, and everyone's just completely fascinated by the way, obviously, things happen behind the scenes in the football industry. And that's what, in effect, gave Dan and I the idea of maybe 50 Ways would be a brilliant vehicle to be able to try and give all of these kids who might not know about these fantastic jobs the chance, because what Dan said right at the beginning resonated with me as well. I wrote the first book that I did, and we wrote this because this wasn't available for us when we were growing up. We just had to sort of not make it up as we go along, but in a way it was like, well, how am I going to work in the football industry? How's this going to happen for us? And we just found our way in very disparate ways, but that brought us together, and that was through the love of writing and through our love of football.
Amazing, thank you. And going back to when you was a child, or even as a grown up, what was your favourite children's book? We'll start with you, Daniel.
Well, I'm gonna it was always Roald Dahl for me. I still remember when I was quite young thinking Roald Dahl books were a bit more grown-up boys and girls books rather than for any age. And I remember being quite young reading The Witches and being a little bit scared with The Witches actually, and The Twits as well. And just thinking, it sounds really odd to say, or it's not the right word, but just be like, this book's for me. This book's for me, and not just reading it once, but obviously reading it 10 times. And I remember also then the sort of next transition I had was was probably 10 or 11 or 12, maybe 11, 12, where I started reading John Grisham's Pelican Brief. And I always, at the same point, thought that John Grisham was for adults or for much older people, and feeling very proud coming back from holiday reading John Grisham, and everyone being like, "Oh, you've read John Grisham?" I was like, "It's just a great story." I sort of loved the story of it. So I don't know if there's a theme, but the theme always was sort of punching above my own age grade in terms of what I thought I could read and then what I actually enjoyed reading. But yeah, it was always the Twits and the Witches to start with.
Dan?
I've sort of went up and down with reading. Like when I was really young, my mum would take me to the library on a Saturday morning. And libraries are amazing. Like it's a bit like going to a shop and stealing everything, and they just say, "Yeah, come bring it back in a few weeks." And I would always make her take out The Tiger That Came to Tea and The Very Hungry Caterpillar. And I think as kids, you like to know the story, and so I would just make her read it to me over and over and again. And those two books were beautiful, and I can still remember being in the flat where I first was born, and me reading them or her reading them to me. Then, when I got a bit older, I struggled with reading because I felt like everyone was trying to make me read, and I'm really stubborn. And none of the books that they were trying to make me read felt like they were for me. They were so like if they're about like if you're 9 years old, I wasn't a very good reader of fiction, and you're reading something about war or whatever. It was just too much for me. It was too dry, and it wasn't. The reason Roald Dahl books are great is because they're funny and mischievous and exciting. But I didn't find any books that I thought were for me at the time. So I went through this period probably from around 10 to 14 where I couldn't find anything, which was why, and so I thought I hated reading, which was, as we said before, why I ended up writing the Jamie Johnson books. Then there was a book called Fever Pitch, which was a bit of a revelation for me because it was a novel which was about football, and I was like, oh, it can be called a novel and people can call it a proper book and I can enjoy it too. But for many years I struggled basically between The Tiger That Came to Tea and Fever Pitch.
That's quite a transition.
Yeah, exactly. With maybe only a bit of Roald Dahl thrown in. But what I would do every day is read all the newspaper reports about football in the papers, and I didn't even realise that was reading. So I was still getting my fix, and obviously now reading is such a big part of my life, mentally, psychologically, professionally. But I also know what it's like to think of yourself as not being a reader.
Absolutely. And I say that because I always promote libraries on my travels because I am dyslexic. But I've always loved reading. So the way that my dyslexia has an impact on me is handwriting, spelling, grammar, mispronounced words. But reading has always been central to myself. And libraries. So when I was a child, it was either going to the adventure playground or go into the library with my brothers and my sister, and we would just, 4 books, that's all we were able to loan at that particular time, go back home, and we would swap books with each other. And there are some libraries now you can go in to camera children that you can take out up to 25 books and it's free. So I am always, and you can loan 50 ways into football from your library.
It's the most beautiful thing, like whatever you want to be, whatever you want to learn about, I think that we must, I know the world is different and there's the internet and you can access things on the internet, but I feel like libraries are representative of hope in our lives. And so just having them there is a great opportunity for all of us at any age.
I've got a thing about libraries as well. It's interesting, everyone has different categorizations of the things that they remember about libraries or whatever. My overriding feeling, recollection of libraries is actually from my GCSEs and my A-level years, where I'd actually go to the library in order to have real quiet time away from distraction, which I think is obviously, a major part of libraries as well. You have to be quiet in there. You have to have time to yourself. Unless you're so immersed in the book, which is the whole point of being a library, then it must be a ridiculously boring place to be in a library. But it's the whole point of going into libraries. For me, it was part revision, part avoid distraction, part focus. The library in Allerton in Liverpool was literally my place that I would go for 7-8 hours a day, and just get into the rhythm of learning and revision and creativity, and that was the place. The smell of like the detergent, like whatever it was. There was the sensory recollections of stuff. I'm sure you have the same. I feel quite strongly about still 20 years on.
And that's why I love the smell of a new book, because it's that sensory explosion. And now in many libraries, they have homework clubs. They have the summer reading schemes. There's so many things that a child can do within a library, and make suggestions to the librarians as well. 50 Ways into Football, and the front cover is beautifully illustrated by
George Garcia.
Fantastic. So how would you summarize this most amazing book?
I think it's so many kids love football. Maybe when I go into a classroom, I would say almost like 80% of kids love football. And effectively 0 of them are going to be professional footballers. I also work with academies, the professional club academies, and even those ones that are playing in the academies, many of them are not going to be footballers. So then it's this dichotomy almost of, you've got kids who are obsessed with football, they're not going to be footballers, which was exactly the same position that Daniel or I are in. And we know, don't we, that if you want to do well in your job, if you want to work really hard to be the success that you hope you'll be, you're going to need to work so hard. So really, kids growing up should look towards having a career in something that they love. So therefore, put those things together. How can kids get a job involving football, and what jobs are there? And this book was an exploration of just 50, because there are probably more, just 50 of the ways that they can have a career which involves football. And we wanted to show, no matter how your mind works, no matter what talent you've got, if you're really good at it, football will want you. And we spoke to some fascinating people.
And Daniel, is that how you would summarize the book?
Perfectly. So I think just building on what we were talking about before around our obsession, our joint obsession with football, what I found as well when I was either reading about it, listening, watching, drawing it, coming up with stories myself, the information about football stuck that much easier. When I read something about football, be it a transfer or behind the scenes or what was going on with the industry, I felt like the dots were congealing together or were just coming together, which meant that when we talked about football, it was almost like we knew quite a lot about what was going on. And so what I always felt with law and the football as the sort of byproduct was I could speak the language of the football industry in a legal context. You hope that you're going to be a good lawyer, you're going to be able to understand contracts and whatever else it might be. But I think part of the challenge in any industry is, do you understand what's actually going on? And I always felt that that was my superpower in a way, not because I'm bragging that I know everything about football. I absolutely don't. But we would just consume everything about football, and so much stuck, which then for me meant I was just able to give opinions. I was able to start conversations. People knew that you weren't just talking nonsense, maybe sometimes with me, but on the whole, you could feel that the industry, just as Dan said, was for me and I was for the industry, and it sort of worked in a nice symbiotic way.
Well, just to say, so that it's taking that and then putting in someone's hand a guidebook. So, okay, you've got that desire, that hunger to work in football. So have a look at some of these options that are open to you.
And I think, and one of the points I wanted to pick up a bit further, where you hear so many boys and girls that have been signed from an early age, and they get to about 18 and they're not taken any further in the journey. And for me, in terms of how that impacts on their self-esteem and self-worth, and that for me is one of the why this book is so important. It's like saying, hey, you can't play professional football, but what other skills and talents are you able to use within the football industry?
We both work with lots of clubs, lots of players, and we're trying to get this book into as many young footballers' hands as possible, because I think that's part of our responsibility, part of the club's responsibility. Because as you say, even it goes so deep into identity. Like if you're playing for X club and you say, I am a footballer, what then happens to your self-worth if that is taken away? Who are you? Who do you see yourself as? So we're trying to get to the point where we say, I play football, it's one of the things I do, but also I do this, and I like reading about law or psychology or nutrition. And so if you can see yourself in those different ways, then if one of them gets taken away, i.e. football, you can still go on and pursue the other path.
And I
Absolutely.
think I think Dan's exactly right, which is ultimately you want to be able to broaden the narrative. I think otherwise, if you just have all these people that think the only thing they can do is how skillful they are with their feet rather than how skillful they can be with their brain, it becomes a much bigger conversation to be able to have. And everybody has this, regardless of whoever they are, has something which is unique to them. And their ability to be able to hopefully be inspired by someone that says one particular sentence in our book that takes someone down then a new path, I guess is what we're after.
Absolutely. And when I go into schools and do authors visits, and if it's an assembly, I have a slide with me with Henry Wilkner, who played the Fonz. And one of he's dyslexic like myself, and I'd met him once, and he kept on saying in his speech, what is your greatness? What are you great at? And for me, it's about saying that with this 50 Ways into Football. Everybody has a skill and a talent, which leads me on quite nicely. What is your favourite page in the book, Daniel? You may both have the same page that you might want to chip in as to why that's your favourite page.
Well, apart from Dan's pages, obviously in the book, you know, so the thing that was fantastically gratifying about the book was obviously Declan Rice, who's the Arsenal England player, wrote the foreword. He's one of the clients that we've had a good relationship with over the years. And the thing is also, as well as obviously having a relationship with Declan and him being great in helping promote the book, was actually probably the stronger relationship I have is actually with Declan's parents, Sean and Steph, and they're obviously in the book because they're the ones that I was speaking to a lot of the time on all the different things that cropped up with Declan over the last few years. And so Dan and I sort of had this idea of how about we actually try and ask Steph and Sean about their experiences of bringing up a footballer and now an elite footballer and all the challenges and obstacles and difficulties, but also obviously the fun stuff that that happened as a result. So I'm maybe a bit biased because I sort of half did the interview with them, although Dan actually was brilliant in framing the questions and how he wanted to sort of put it to them. But the pages where Sean and Steph effectively talk about what it was like bringing up Declan, the drives to the training ground every day, his meticulous nature of wanting to be there early for every training session, his mindset of when things didn't go necessarily to plan, whether he'd made a bad pass with his left foot or something didn't go right in a match, the feedback that Sean would give and say, well, we actually need to practice on your left foot, and what happens if you're in this position, what would you do again? So what I really liked about what they were saying was, I know everybody takes for granted that these footballers are supposed to be perfection and everything goes exactly to plan. But when you lift the veil up a little bit and you see the development of everybody, it doesn't just go like this. It's, you know, a very difficult trajectory, ups and downs with that. So they were the few pages that that resonated with me just because I felt part of it based on the journey that they've had to.
Fantastic. And Dan?
There are so many, because what we try to do with 50 people working football is say, what's your job? What are the good bits about it? What are the hard bits about it? How close to football do you get? And if someone's reading this that would like to follow in your footsteps, what advice would you give them? So to speak to a translator who's been there, like translating team talks for the players in a dressing room, to speak to the guy who makes the food for Harry Kane and Jack Grealish. That's their job, to provide the nutrition. A woman who's a pilot, who flies private jets, who flies the players around the world. A woman who designed the Brentford Stadium, like to come up with the concept of how this stadium is going to be built and designed, and then see people, thousands of people on a weekly basis go and in the place that you have identified and created. So there are so many, but probably the one I would go for would be this interview that we did with a woman called Liv Cook, who is the world record freestyle champion. Freestyle meaning basically football skills, tricks with the ball. And she's got one of the best mindsets of anyone that I've ever spoken to. Daniel's really into mindsets as well, and I think any of us who want to try and achieve things, we're trying to take tips from people. And this lady, Liv Cook, she was a brilliant footballer. She was at the Blackburn Academy when they were one of the best academies for girls. Like a lot of the Lionesses were there, and she was one of the top players. Then she got a back injury. I know you recently had a back operation. She got a back injury, and she was basically couldn't move. But she still missed her football, and she found that there was one position that she could sort of play around with the football and not be in pain, and that was sitting on the floor. And so she would start keeping the ball up while sitting on the floor. And she's like, I quite like this. She's like, what am I doing here? What's it even called, like keeping the ball? And she found out it was called freestyling. And she looked up on the internet, who's the best freestyler in the world? Because that's how her mind works. If she does anything, she wants to be the best in the world at it. And she's like, right, that is the world record freestyle champion. And then she was like, right, what do they have that I don't have? Because the answer to that question will be what I need to do to be the best in the world at it. And it was the confidence to produce your skills in front of thousands of people without making any mistakes. So Liv Cook got better and better and better at it. There was a crossroads where her back had healed. Instead of going back to being a footballer, she was like, no, I'm going to pursue this road that I'm now on. It's a different road of being a freestyler. And she said she knew she'd made it when she came off Wembley Stadium, having done her skills in front of 80,000 people at half-time in an international match, having not made any mistakes. Not only is she a world record holder, pretty much the best in the world at doing football skills, as we know in the modern world with social media, when a brand wants to launch their new kit or their football boots, they'll get her to do one of her skills videos in their equipment. And so it's her whole business, as well as the sporting ambition and being the best. It's now the business as well. So to meet someone with this incredible mindset and try and transfer her advice into a couple of pages in the books was a great privilege.
I think that's phenomenal. And I think for many as well, wanted to bring in here the fact of, women's football and how Liv's story is going to have an impact on girls and boys as well. I think it's a fabulous story to read.
And Daniel can speak to like the rise of the women's game and some of your clients.
It's been an astronomical rise over the last few years, especially, and we've seen from the women's England team winning the Euros to getting to the World Cup final, to hopefully having another good Euros this summer. And I think Alessia Russo, who obviously is in the book as well and is fantastic in so many ways, she sort of said it best, where she talks about how if it's for you to be a football player, or if it's you to be a referee, or it's for you to be a commentator, there are so many roles in the game that are available regardless of whether you're a boy or a girl. But with that sort of drive and passion, you can achieve anything you want to do. And I think it's really important that there's especially a new generation of female footballers that are actually getting the same visibility and airtime than their male compatriots. Now, there's an argument that says that the women's England team have actually been considerably more successful over the decades than the male team, which some people find controversial. I think it's just quite objectively easy to say. But more importantly than that, I think when you have those elite performing role models, you as a young girl feel that if you can see it, you can do it. And that's why I think we were at pains to stress when we were actually brainstorming in the first place, weren't we? It was like, well, we don't want to have 50 men talking about their roles or ways into football. We need to be able to have such a diverse group of people that have made their way into the game through all the different avenues, so that it doesn't matter who you are that's going to pick up that book, that there'll be someone with a similar background to you that will hopefully inspire or start you on that journey to the thing that you might not even realize you wanted to do.
And the publishers were great. Like, our target was as close to 50% as possible, men and women working in football. And so I remember a brilliant one was spoke to a woman who's a police officer. So she travels with the fans home and abroad, keeping them safe. Could you have a more important job than that? Perhaps one of the most other really important jobs was the team doctor, you know, who might come on and even save someone's life. So we spoke to Dr. Kai Win, this woman who grew up in Myanmar, the other side of the world, and now she's first team doctor at Wolves. And we spoke to a woman called Bryony, and she said when she was younger, her and her brother used to doodle little kits and strips, design them when they were at school or at home, just messing around really. And now she's a kit designer, she's designed England kits. You know, that's an example, a few examples of some of these amazing women that we're very proud to feature in the book.
Fantastic. And then, but what question would you ask yourself about this book? If you was interviewing yourself, what question?
Bit like what Daniel was saying, could you tell us like the reality of being on the inside? Because that's all of us who are fans of the game. We want to know.
I want to know all the gossip about all the footballers.
That essentially, that is, if you're working in football, anyone who's not working in football but who loves it wants to know what's happening.
Yeah, and I think the flip side is also true, which is what's the actual reality of working in the football industry. And I think the whole point of the book is obviously to really inspire people, but to know that if you want to do anything and want to do it well, there's a lot of hard work, sacrifice, dedication, discipline, routine that's sort of necessary. And the sugar-coated approach is, oh, you work in football, it must be fantastic and it's glitzy and it's glamorous and everything. But actually, the truth is, a lot of my transfers, for example, that I help with are done in my office in Soho, in front of a computer screen at 2 o'clock in the morning, depending on deadlines and everything else. So the flip side of everything is, if you really want to go hard and find that right job for you,
What's your office address again?
yeah, you'll see me there when so it just depends. So fantastic to be working in football, but I think especially when you start off in the industry, you have to make some sacrifices, just like you would do in many industries in the areas that you really want to work into.
Fantastic.
And the other thing I say when I'm working in schools or with students and kids, it's quite fun. I say, right, go through the book, see the 50 jobs, now get rid of 45 of them that you don't either have any interest in or wouldn't want to do. Then you've got 5 and look into them a bit deeper and nail it down to 3. So it's quite fun sort of saying, right, end up with 3 that you would be interested to do in your future and in your life, and then think about how you could progress towards doing one of those. A bit of work experience, getting in contact with someone, maybe starting your own blog or YouTube channel or whatever it may be. But I think it's quite nice to put the power in the kids' hands and say, right, immediately get rid of 40 of them, because then that will start to hone down where your interests lie.
And the other thing, Dan, that you said, which was so many times when you've had kids read the book, it's certainly been the case with me. Everyone, I think all the kids have the preconceived idea, like I want to be a football agent, or I want to, be involved in the first team action or a manager or whatever. And they read the book and they say, you know what? Actually, I'd love to be a pilot, or I'd love to do the thing that I had no idea about was a possible avenue. So I think a lot of the time that the idea with the 50 ways, even though it's not every possible job, is there are such variety that the novelty of one particular thing suddenly springs out to the page of some of these kids, which is lovely to see.
It's just excellent career advice as well on many different levels, isn't it? So I would say, what do you want children to take away from 50 Ways into Football?
I'll just start really briefly, which is, for me, it is quite a simple message, which is read what lots of people have done and realize it's as accessible for them as it is for you.
Dan?
Yeah, I think it's turning an idea, which is I want to work in football, into a practical opportunity and a pathway for you. And so this is your guidebook, this is your roadmap, this is your opportunity to work in football.
And I'm going to say one more thing as well, which is maybe the story about the book, which is, you know, the thing that I love working with Dan, well, the things I love working with Dan the most is you're a doer. And hopefully I am to a degree as well. And this book was born from ideas that were in our brains that we managed to make a reality. So I'm always somehow amazed that we actually managed to do it. It's not because it's not a fantastic achievement, just because, you know, when people talk about things, to actually then do it, I find fascinating, or rather the opposite, which is people talk a lot about things but then end up not doing things. So anybody that's been an author, anyone that has had an idea, you know, the tough part is actually converting the idea into practice. And that's why I'm really proud of the book, but also proud to have worked with so many of the people in the book to make it a reality.
Well, essentially what we've done, if you imagine walking into a room and 50 of the most inspirational, successful people working in football are there, and you can ask them anything you want, that's what we've done, basically. That book is like walking into a room of 50 of the most important, successful, charismatic, influential people in football, and you can chat to them through the book and the stories that they tell you.
And isn't that an excellent point to finish on? And I think the point that you made, Daniel, there, to summarise, you had this idea, you went away, you executed the book, and to quote a famous brand, just do it. Just do it. You got that idea. But thank you both so much for this inspiring interview. I've learned so much in terms of, I thought I knew everything about football. There you are. In terms of the stories, the different professions that anybody can get into, 50 ways into football, and you too can read this book. And remember, as I always say, to use your local library. It's all free. And I always finish off with Claudia and Tessa's point. They always say at the end of Strictly, they say keep dancing, I say keep reading. This podcast was woven in partnership with our friends at Tapestry, the childhood education platform. They have kindly devised the educational resources for each podcast interview. Tapestry helps you celebrate children's learning, improve communication with families, and streamline your admin with powerful booking, invoicing, and management tools, giving you more time for what matters, the children and you. Visit tapestry.info to find out more. This podcast series was recorded at the Quick Brown Fox Video Production Studios in Wandsworth Town, London, with top-notch equipment and a knowledgeable team who are always happy to help. Recording our podcast has been a breeze.